So welcome to the Closer Look feature for '08 March 2023. It is focused on China and Latin America, part two, Brazil. Last week, we did an overview of China and Latin America, a very high level. This week, we're going to drill down a little bit more into China's relationship, specifically with Brazil being the major player, obviously, in South America. The agenda looks like this. But again, you receive the agenda in your email, so we won't linger too long here. Um, the ties between China and Brazil are certainly significant, but one of the things you might notice there is there's not a military component in the agenda. I'm going to touch on that briefly in the next slide, just when I talk about overall relations, but the military relationship between China and Brazil is not particularly significant. Depending on your worldview, that may be great news to you. But let's dive in to the closer look feature on China and Brazil. So overall relations, formal diplomatic relations between Brazil and the PRC, the current ruling party there in China, began in 1974. This is when they announced and opened embassies in each other's countries. But not much happened for decades after that. So in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was little headway into to Brazil by China or by China into Brazil. So it was kind of a stalled relationship. They essentially forgot about each other more or less. There's very little economic ties were being made, very little trade, zero military cooperation for those decades, 70s, 80s, 90s. In the early 2000s is essentially when China was rising in a significant way. They were coming onto the world stage heavily. The BRIC, it was BRIC back then, now it's BRICS Plus, but at the time, the BRIC economic bloc was beginning to be formed and was formalized in 2006. But in the early 2000s is really when all of this activity between China and Brazil really kicked off and got going. So this is not necessarily a relationship with a long and storied history per se, as you see between some other countries. Military imports, I'm just going to touch on this very briefly. Brazil's military imports are all over the map. They're from France, US, they're some from India, some from the UK, some from Germany, but not very much military equipment is imported into Brazil from China. They have essentially integrated themselves with Western and NATO equipment at this point. And so while they do purchase a bit of military equipment from China, they don't purchase very much. Also notable is that Brazil has had a hesitancy to form any kind of military alliance with China on any level. There have been some minor exercises and things of that nature, but nothing terribly significant. There's certainly a hesitancy on Brazil's part to go that route with China. And I think a part of that as well is just because Brazil is a significant military power on its own right. It doesn't have any immediate threat from any of its neighbors. It's isolated by oceans from Africa and Europe and Asia, etc. There's just not a lot of need for Chinese military aid or cooperation by Brazil. So they haven't really pursued it. China has made overtures to that direction, and Brazil, for the most part, has indicated that they're just not particularly interested. So there's not much on that in this presentation just because there's not much there to discuss. Let's look at some political considerations though. So here you're seeing presidents of Brazil from 2003 to present. So the last 20 years. Lula was president 03 to 2010. He's extremely pro-China. The image you see there is Lula and China's President Xi from that era. You had Rousseff from 2011 to 2016. She was the first female president in Brazil's history. She was extremely pro-China and still is. So interesting note in the research, we pulled up that she is actually going to be the head of the BRICS Bank as of March. So Lula's going to Beijing in March. He has sponsored her for the position. Xi has agreed. The entire bloc has agreed. And she is going to be the head of the BRICS Bank, probably at the end of March, around the time when Lula goes, which is March 28th. Um, so she's extraordinarily pro-China. She's going to actually live in Shanghai, and potentially has already moved there. But she's so pro-China that she's going to live there and head up the BRICS Bank. Timur was next from 2016 to 2018, extremely pro-China. It's very easy to find a lot when it comes to him. He was constantly saying things like the relationship is extremely important. The relationship to China is of fundamental importance to Brazil, et cetera. And then came 2019, Bolsonaro, and he was moderately anti-China. It is believed, and I think there's a lot of evidence that he's very anti-China, but at the same time, he had to put up something of a facade because of how interwoven their economies were becoming. He did say things like China was trying to buy Brazil. They weren't working with Brazil. They were going to buy Brazil. He did not want to allow Huawei communications equipment into Brazil. So he complicated things really between China and Brazil just because he was not as overtly pro-China as the previous three presidents were. For example, he called COVID the China virus, echoing President Trump, things of that nature. So um, China pushed back on him for a lot of his anti-Chinese comments and things of that nature. But generally speaking, it was more of a fluid relationship between officials, not presidents, and not a ton of damage done. So there was a bit of a pause there. The relationship was not quite as friendly. But again, Lula, as of the 1st of January 2023, is back in office, and he is extraordinarily pro-China. And so we would expect something of an acceleration there between Brazil and China. Again, that was only briefly paused by Bolsonaro's time in office. Couple of economic organizations that are really important to China specifically. Obviously, BRICS. Brazil is the B in BRICS, and China is the C. It's also Russia, India, and South Africa. So they're both a huge, huge part of BRICS. Both participate in that to a major level. So they're tied together there. But Brazil is not a participant in China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's actually one of the few Latin American countries that are not participating in Belt and Road. Brazil has a tradition, essentially, of not participating in initiatives like Belt and Road if they are not a founding member, which they are not. It's just one of the few countries that kind of has this tradition. They don't necessarily need it because there's already significant direct ties with China. So there's been no memorandum of understanding with China on this coming from Brazil. The other reason too is because Brazil receives a significant amount of China's foreign direct investment. And so why join Belt and Road? That's essentially what you get with Belt and Road. So no participant there in that particular initiative. Economic data. So if you're looking for some years to kind of put in your memory here, here's a few for you. China became Brazil's largest trading partner in the year 2009. This up from only 2% in 2000. So 2% in 2000 to 32% in 2020. That's that 30% increase in exports from 2 to 32. That's a huge thing. That is a massive jump that you almost never see between trading partners. And really the entire relationship, and I'm about to show you some charts to illustrate this point, but the entire relationship really revolves around Brazil's natural resources and ability to produce commodities. China is starving for all forms of raw material. They are always chasing down commodities of various types, almost of any type, anywhere that they can be found. And Brazil is a major producer of all kinds of raw commodities that China desperately needs. I'll show you some more information on that as we go along. Looking at the last few years, or at least the 2019 to 2021 uh, chart, this is bilateral trade and change in exports from 2019 to 2021. So you can see there's a bit of a hiccup there around COVID 2020. And it's certainly not consistent. It's up and down and all around, but a pretty steady uptrend. This chart only covers a few years, but it's consistent with other blocks of data. If you look at 2016 to 2019, for example. A lot of times this type of data comes out slowly, so we don't have any for last half of 2022, for example. But this is a pretty typical chart when it comes to bilateral trade percentages increasing and decreasing over time. Pretty steady uptick, no matter how you choose to slice it. Now, this is the merchandise trade between the two nations from 2001 to 2020. So if you look back to 2001, it's essentially non-existent. And even 2006, when BRIC was first formally introduced and established, not a lot going on there, but it exploded in the 2010 to 2012 timeframe and really never looked back from there. So the relationship is huge. This is trade in millions of US dollars. So as you can see, as of 2020 anyway, commodities alone were almost 70, up to almost almost that 70 mark, 65 we'll call it. But the interesting thing here is commodities dominate, but these commodities are all going one direction. They're going from Brazil to China. Everything you see there at the bottom, this is what's flowing into Brazil. So blue at the top is out of Brazil. Everything else is into Brazil. So you can see that the medium and high technology sections, so manufactured medium and high technology goods, is where you see the most growth from China into Brazil. So this relationship, it's very clear economically anyway. It's commodities into China and low, medium, and high tech mostly into Brazil. That's the exchange that you're looking at between these two countries. I'll illustrate this for you a little bit further here. So these are exports to China from Brazil. And this is a recent graphic as well, so it is up to date. You've got soy. This is number one. China imports massive amounts of soy from all over the world, but including from the United States. But Brazil, that is their primary import from Brazil. You've got iron ore. Okay, you've got crude oil, beef, so all the way down through this list. These are all essentially raw commodities, with soy, iron, and crude by far dominating everything else that you see here on this list. But again, heavy commodity focus by China in Brazil. Now, when you flip this around and look at Chinese exports to Brazil, so it's going into Brazil, one, you'll notice immediately that these are much smaller numbers, right? From China, you've got 17 billion, right, that China's in soy that China is purchasing from Brazil. Go over here, all of this combined does not add up to 17 billion. So there are a lot fewer Chinese exports to Brazil than Brazilian exports into China. There is certainly a significant trade deficit there. But again, if you look at these products, these are often medium technology or high technology. Telecommunications equipment dominates. All types of industrial use equipment, things like that. Organo and inorganic compounds is typically chemicals of various kinds. But that's your relationship in two charts. Commodities one way, produced and manufactured products coming back the other way. Now, the future danger for Brazil within this relationship is something that absolutely bears noting and bears taking a little bit more time to consider. Um, so a 2021 UN report that we uncovered during our research essentially argues that Brazil shares the characteristics of other commodity dependent nations, other developing countries that are heavily dependent upon commodities for their economy. So you see some of the things here: low growth, macroeconomic instability, difficulty in raising productivity, difficulty in diversifying economic output. You could also say in difficulty in diversifying the composition of the nation itself, moving from, for example, low skilled workers to high skilled workers, moving up the ladder that way. That's very difficult for nations who generate the majority of their GDP from commodities or have a heavy commodity focus. So Brazil really, going into the future, Brazil needs to diversify its economic production. They need to lean into the industrial, commercial, and service sectors. They need to bring their workforce up from from low skill to high skill, particularly in tech sectors and things of that nature, because right now it's a huge over reliance on commodity exports. Now, interestingly, if you look at the chart there on the right that we grabbed from The Economist, you see the flow of Chinese investment to Brazil dropping off significantly, particularly after about 2011. You got a little spike there, 15, 16, 17, but overall the trend is certainly down when it comes to Chinese investment in Brazil. Um, Over this period of time that you see here, really the big investors are Chinese oil and mineral companies, particularly focused on iron ore and things of that nature, and obviously crude. Um, so it's pretty concentrated. Chinese investment is pretty concentrated today in those two areas. A lot of the investment into Brazilian infrastructure is still going on to an extent, ports and things of that nature, which we covered that last week in our closer look segment. But a lot of the investment in agriculture and building up the infrastructure specifically for agriculture has more or less dried up. Um, you're seeing that the electric and water sectors are getting a little bit of investment. But again, Chinese direct investment stock and infrastructure, per a UN report, went from 0.6% of total Chinese investment in 2010 to more than half in 2019. So heavy shift and a heavy focus there. Now, China is a very important player in Brazil when it comes to investment. But again, over time, there's indicators at least that China thinks that Brazil is as good as it's going to get. It's exporting as much as it's going to export to China, and they're simply content to begin shutting off the investment spigots a little bit and let things run how they are. Um, so Brazil being in the trap essentially of being heavily commodity dependent is something that China has encouraged over the last 20 years and is continuing to encourage, because China needs Brazilian commodities to a massive extent, much more so really than Brazil needs China. But the position that Brazil is in right now is one that could put them in a very difficult economic place into the future should they not be able to diversify away from commodities. And China is more or less encouraging them to remain commodity dependent. Again, one of the ways they're doing that is they're not investing in any kind of tech sector or higher technology projects inside of Brazil that would help the Brazilians to lift themselves out of a commodity dependent economy to an extent. So there is certainly risk there for Brazil going into the future. However, Brazil has also been more cautious about closer integration with China than other Latin American nations. And what do I mean by that? One is the military aspect that we've already talked about at the beginning of the briefing, that they are very cautious about drawing closer to China militarily. They don't buy a lot of arms from China, et cetera. I won't belabor that point. But the other is they typically are very cautious about signing any additional agreements, really of any kind, with China. So they're not a signatory to Belt and Road. They could probably gain some benefit from that should they play it the right way, but they simply don't have a desire to do that. Um, they are not really a strategic partner with China in any way. So when you see drills between China and Russia and South Africa, like what we just saw off the coast of South Africa a week or two ago, oftentimes Brazil doesn't participate in those things. They're pretty content to have a friendly, but not too friendly relationship with China. They're content to sell them commodities. They're content to take investment and import technological goods of various types. But overall, for Brazil, this is not a country that is running straight into the arms of China. Now, Lula is back in office, and Lula is extremely pro China. So we'll see what effect that has over the next several years. But there are many in the Brazilian government that kind of cast a wary eye toward China and are concerned about what they see China doing in other countries, even other Latin American countries. So Brazil is certainly friendly with China, but at the same time, not foolishly so, is how I would characterize that. Um, there is a familiar pattern in Latin America that China has implemented over the years. You lead with investment, focus on infrastructure and raw materials. You extract as many raw materials as possible, so you expand that infrastructure so that you can mine the country as much as you can. While you're doing that, you form some kind of arms deal with the country. You start military cooperation a bit, and then you convert Chinese built civilian projects into military use or at least military capable, right? Those are the steps that we see China implementing all around the world. Well, that's stalled out a little bit between extract as many raw materials as you can and increase or form direct military cooperation. That's where the relationship is right now, and it has stalled out, is how I would describe that, um, which is most likely the best possible thing for Brazil's future. Sell the commodities you need to sell, but be cautious when it comes to drawing closer politically or militarily. This closer look will likely have to be updated after 18 months or so of the Lula presidency, but we'll be happy to do that if it needs doing. And then we will also continue the closer look features, taking a look at China and Latin America in the coming weeks. So I appreciate the participation by everyone. I'm looking at my chat here and don't see any questions. Again, feel free to respond to any Knightsbridge email with any questions you may have, or hit us up on Twitter. That's great too. And we'll answer whatever questions you may have. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate the support very much, and we will see you next week.